Since Prince died, when he died, I wrote a piece for the New Yorker, a very short piece about him, but as I'm sure many of you have, if you're fans, I've thought about him a lot since then, so I've been sort of adding pieces to that piece. And so here this is, I will not be before you long because I, like you, want to hear some music. But this is about Prince's freedom. It wasn't uncommon when I was a kid to hear older black people voicing their worries about Prince. These were the early 90s when, in order to spite his record label, Warner Brothers, he had changed his name to an unpronounceable glyph. The nigger's gone crazy, I heard a time or two from the back seat of my father's old car. A joke of my mom's was to call him simply the artist formerly known. But even then, I sensed a kind of ambivalence, a double-mindedness that never made its way fully into words. On the one hand, sure, this was a particularly odd episode in the career of a man whose entire act was a tiptoe between the recognizable and the bizarre. Perhaps he finally lost his footing. But there was something else in those voices, I can hear it now, a kind of admiration. Sometimes I think it verged on envy. Who is he, they seem to want to say, to be so free? In his music and in his inimitable style, his sexual wit and his teasing, almost tossed off sophistication, who after all was freer than Prince? Who else could turn a pair of high heels into a sign of machismo? Or a gender fluid symbol into a sign of financial and artistic independence? Or make a bit of absent fabric on the seat of his pants a joke about cleavage and exposure and expectation? Who else could imply a whole world of questions and unlikely answers with a lift of one exquisite eyebrow? He was a genius of that greatest American notion. This wasn't a selfish freedom either. He could do anything, it seemed, in this cleared way for us to do anything, imagine anything, and this limitlessness it felt like a kind of patriotism. It began, of course, with the music. He broke out in the final years of the 70s by offering a funk-infused comment on the soul and R&B that had dominated radio waves and tour stages in the 50s and 60s. Even in his earliest performances, take for example his 1979 appearance on American Bandstand. So he's wearing platforms and glittery gold pants, a flipped up feathery bob, and a cheetah patterned guitar string. He was already a wonderful hybrid. He crooned in a falsetto like Eddie Kendricks's, but pushed it outward and into grittier places. Like his idol James Brown, he peacocked, moved his hips, pulled his band along as if by an invisible string, but he did all of this with a lazy, almost bored precision, borrowed from blues-based rock and roll. Even as the years rolled on and he passed into what we now think of his quintessential period, beginning with the provocations of Dirty Mind and Controversy, then proceeding through the towering 80s run that included 1999, Purple Rain, and Sign of the Times, which Robert Christgau rightly praised as the best pop musician of his generation, proving what a motherfucker he is for 2 discs, start to finish. He added new dimensions to his musical Creole, arriving at a sound that was unlike any other, before or since, in its quality and complexity. Now you could hear a touch of gospel ecstasy, most famously in Purple Rain, forever his tour de force, leavened by a hint of the jazz man's droll, ironic delivery. As a lyricist, he was avant-garde. Often, as in I Would Die For You, he crafted symbolic structures that, depending on the listener's mood, could be read as sensual or devotional or both. He could also play the sly, folky storyteller. In one of my favorites, When You Were Mine, he recalls sweet, sad details. When you were mine, he yelps, I used to let you wear all my clothes, leading one to expect a conventional recounting of love and loss. But then he makes a surprise turn into a tale of a complicated threesome. I never was the kind to make a fuss, he says, when he was there sleeping in between the two of us. All of this was enabled by a technical ability rarely matched in the history of pop. He was a subtle, instinctive drummer who made rhythm sound like speech. Jazz harmonies sneaked into his songs by way of his off-kilter keyboard parts. His voice was incredibly plastic. Often, as in my mom's favorite, The Most Beautiful Girl in the World, he would swoop up the scale from doo-wop double bass to a spiky, exultant soprano over the course of a single song. He was a stud most of all on the guitar. Having from the beginning displayed his abilities as a funk player, steady grooves and uncanny control, he gradually revealed his power as a soloist. Perhaps the best indication of that power is the 2004 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony. Some of you guys have seen this video. Eclipsing the likes of Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne. That performance is instructive. Midway through the song, the light finds Prince in a pinstripe suit and a blood-red bowler hat. His shirt, unbuttoned at the sternum, is the same striking shade of red, and a rough spit of hair pokes out from his chest. He begins the solo with several long, unfussy notes, as flat as his native Minnesota, then starts to add little curlicues, gathering in intensity until he is playing an unabashedly mournful blues. He shifts again, making an almost pointed tour through the history of electric guitar, now blazing showily through 16th notes, now grabbing the middle frets of his guitar like a throat and forcing out a series of low, stepwise moans. At one point, he turns his back to the crowd and falls woozily backward over the lip of the stage, where a bulky guard has materialized just in time to catch him and push him gently back into the action. At the end of the song, he sloughs off the guitar, tosses it into the crowd, and slinks silently off the stage. His guitar work was closely entwined with this old-school, hard work vision of showmanship, plus an ambiguity and sly humor that always characterized his live and televised performances. In earlier performances, like another famous 1982 gig at the Capitol Theater in New Jersey, he showed hints of that hybrid power. In that show, he begins with a haunting a cappella gospel, powerfully harmonized, then spaces out into sweaty, rockish thrusts. But by later in the decade, Prince as persona had developed something of what Ralph Ellison, in describing Duke Ellington, once called creative mockery. He'd somehow gathered all of the trouble that ailed the America of the 80s, AIDS, urban decay, crack cocaine, laissez-faire public policy, and held it up under the spotlight, and invited us to see it as a long-running joke. What else, he sometimes seemed to say, could we do? Miles Davis once said that Prince was not only a descendant of Marvin Gaye and Jimi Hendrix, but also of Charlie Chaplin. There is some of this on display in the famous concert at Syracuse, New York, where in a sparkling black hooded robe, Prince stretched Purple Rain into a 20-minute tent revival. If you have not seen this, you have to see this. It's tinged a candy purple. Again, the guitar determines the shape of things. The solos go on and on, each more desperate and intense than the last. Prince trots around, sings, plays. He changes guitars early on, and the first note on the new setup sounds like a bassoon through a speaker. Those violet lights suggest a dream world, but Prince's sweat and effort seem to come from the world of toil and upheaval. This dual sense of realism and abandon that suffused Prince's stagecraft in Syracuse and elsewhere was a kind of invitation, not to ignore the chaos outside the stadium, but to acknowledge and then transcend it. The greatest object of this kind of transcendence was sex, and its corollary notions of male and female social roles. Prince came along after the great sexual revolution of the 60s, but before a new order could settle into being. New forms of gender expression had begun to flower all over the pop landscape, especially via disco and the New York City dance underground, but few had so brazenly put this question to a mainstream intent on whistling past new, freer ideas about sex. In this way, Prince was a kind of gender prophet. His play on sexuality via ambiguous lyrics and spectacular clothes predated Judith Butler's famous naming of gender performance and the trouble that might flow from it. So much of what the younger generation takes for granted, gender worn ever so slightly more loosely. multiculturalism in the key of Sly Stone as a definition of cool, a right to name oneself all the way down to the level of pronouns, symbols, signs, it owes in part to Prince, who laughed at labels all those decades ago and kept on laughing through the years. In this way, and for example, in a song like Controversy, in which he wishes that, quote, there was no black and white, he offers an echo of the poet Jean Toomer, who is another one of the touchstones in DUAT, who spent his entire life in a struggle against labels. Toomer once asserted in a notebook that, quote, I am simply of the human race. I am of the human nation. I am of earth. O singers, he says, resinous and soft your songs above the sacred whisper of the pines. Give virgin lips to cornfield concubines. Bring dreams of Christ to dusky cane-lipped throngs. In his own way, Prince could pull the same trick. Take the kind of obscure song, And God Created Woman, which turns the creation story as told in Genesis into a tale of sexual magnetism. Prince says, temptation sweet and so much. Surely die if neither one of us shall ye touch. Then again we could die from the rush, heart of my heart, and God created woman. Much it turned out to the detriment of his literary career, Toomer was a lifelong seeker of spiritual experience. He was among the most prominent American devotees of George Gurdjieff, a crackpot Soviet mystic who taught mind-body consciousness by way of hard labor. That hard labor happened on his farm, so it was very convenient for him. Later he dipped into, then out of Quakerism, did Toomer, then experimented with Jungian therapy and L. Ron Hubbard's Dianetics, which is now known as Scientology. These strainings aside, and here's where I think of Prince, who well before the date in question advised us to party like it's 1999, Toomer always left time at the end of the day for what he called the deserving hour, a time to talk, eat, and especially drink. For those of you who haven't seen DUAT, there's a moment that I think is a very sort of Toomerian deserving hour, but I don't want to give it away. The two were different as men and as artists. Unlike Toomer, Prince was not shy about his ancestry and found in Black experience a generous vein of creativity. But it did seem to share Toomer's expansive, almost mystical view of America. His hope that the nation could leverage its racial and ethnic diversity to create a new kind of person, never seen before on Earth. All of these sides of Prince, musical miracle, trickster, culture hero, social savant, had something to do with the earnestness and intensity of his religious faith. Funny though he often was, his outlook was fundamentally pious. Everything in his musical world was a purple-washed sacrament. The earth was too special, too holy not to enjoy. Even the orgasm was an agent of salvation. This religious impulse drove him to continue to comment on his country, overtly and in code, as the years brought new changes. Even recently, in the aftermath of Freddie Gray's killing, and at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, he wrote a song for Baltimore that demanded justice, but also pleaded sweetly for peace. Still, like any deeply felt faith, the man himself was at bottom a mystery. Such was the depth of Prince's mystique that any story about him was interesting, and to boot possibly true, as proved by the Chappelle Show sketch in which Charlie Murphy describes a night of picked up basketball, shirts versus blouses, and pancakes at Prince's. Who knew? This perhaps is the greatest freedom, the freedom to confound. Prince always had it. Just look at the cover of his eponymous second album. Someone holds this record up at a wonderful moment in DUAT. This is the album with the sky blue background and Prince's name written in script above his glossy mane of hair. He looks out from the cover with his chest bare, but folded ever so slightly inward. A kind of metaphor for how he offered us the fruit of his gifts, but shrouded in a purple mist, whatever it was that made those gifts so otherworldly. It had something to do with freedom, and something to do with sex, and something to do with his God, but what it all amounted to was as unsayable as the symbol that briefly became his name. This, in the end, is why we only get so far by comparing Prince to his contemporaries, like Ellington, he looked out at us with a quiet, gently mocking love. Like Whitman, he sang a national body shot through with electricity. He rolled his eyes just like Emerson at consistency, that hobgoblin of little minds. He dealt in wit and otherwise withdrew, like a millennial Twain. He gave us what he wanted us to have. And in knowing what there was to know of Prince, and in partaking in the world that he helped create, this freedom that he claimed not only for himself, we are luckier, I think, than we have deserved. Thank you.